At my parents' anniversary party, my sister sneered and told me not to fill my plate because I did not pay for anything. My mom smiled and said real family comes first. I simply nodded, put on my coat, and left. Moments later, the manager delivered an enormous bill to their table. He told them, "The woman in the blue dress canceled the reservation payment and asked me to hand this to you." Their faces completely drained of color. My name is Deandra, and I am 31 years old. Let me know where you are watching from in the comments below, and hit the subscribe button if you have ever had to teach your toxic family a lesson they will never forget. The evening began at one of the most exclusive and expensive restaurants in all of Atlanta. It was a place called L'Etoile, known for its crystal chandeliers, imported marble floors, and a waiting list that took 6 months to clear. Is greater than snorts. Is greater than. Tonight was supposed to be a grand celebration of my parents' 40th wedding anniversary. I arrived at the private dining room wearing a custom-tailored sapphire blue dress, feeling a mix of apprehension and duty. Family events were always a performance, and tonight was no exception. As I walked through the heavy oak doors, the scene was already perfectly orchestrated. My sister Vanessa, who is 34 years old, sat near the center of the table looking like she had stepped out of a luxury magazine. She wore a diamond necklace that caught the light every time she moved and a dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Vanessa was the undeniable golden child of the family. Everything she did was praised, and everything she wanted was handed to her. Next to her sat her husband, Spencer. He is 36 years old, white, and comes from a family that constantly brags about having old money. Spencer carried an air of unearned superiority, talking loudly to the waiter about the vintage of the wine, and making sure everyone within a 50-feet radius knew how sophisticated his palate was. He loved playing the role of the wealthy benefactor who elevated our family status. My parents, Brenda and Jerome, sat at the head of the table beaming at Vanessa and Spencer with absolute adoration. They represented everything my parents valued in life, which was money, status, and the appearance of perfection. I took a deep breath and approached the table holding a carefully wrapped gift for their anniversary. When I sat down in the only empty chair near the end of the table, the atmosphere immediately shifted. The warm smiles my parents had been directing at Vanessa suddenly cooled when they looked at me. There was no warm greeting or asking how my day went. Instead, Vanessa immediately scrutinized my dress and made a passive-aggressive comment about how nice it was that I finally decided to dress up for once. I ignored the dig and placed the gift on the table, congratulating my parents on their 4-decade milestone. My father barely nodded before turning his attention back to Spencer, who was loudly recounting a golf game he had played earlier that week at his exclusive country club. I sat there in silence, feeling the familiar weight of isolation pressing down on me. I was successful in my own right, but my family never cared to ask what I actually did for a living. To them, I was just the rebellious younger daughter who refused to follow their strict rules of social climbing. The waiters began bringing out the first courses of the evening, placing massive towers of seafood, caviar, and truffles on the white tablecloth. The extravagance was overwhelming, and the evening was just getting started. I poured myself a glass of water, preparing for the long hours ahead, knowing that I just had to survive this dinner, and then I could go back to my peaceful life. I had no idea that the real test was about to begin. The dinner progressed with the usual endless boasting from Spencer and Vanessa. They ordered the most expensive items on the menu without a second thought. When the main courses arrived, the table was filled with Wagyu beef, roasted duck, and massive butter-basted lobster tails. I had been listening to them talk over me for the past hour and was feeling quite hungry, so I reached out with my serving fork to take one of the lobster tails from the shared platter in the center of the table. Before my fork could even touch the shell, Vanessa slammed her hand down on my wrist. Her perfectly manicured fingernails dug into my skin as she forcefully shoved my hand away and snatched the entire platter of lobster closer to her side of the table. The sudden violent movement caused several crystal glasses to rattle, and the conversation abruptly stopped. I stared at her in shock, pulling my hand back. I asked her what she was doing, keeping my voice as steady as possible. Vanessa let out a sharp, cruel laugh that echoed loudly enough for the neighboring tables to hear. She looked me up and down with an expression of pure disgust and told me not to fill my plate so quickly. She sneered and said I had absolutely no right to eat the expensive food because I did not pay for anything on this table. Her voice was intentionally loud, designed to embarrass me in front of the restaurant staff and the wealthy patrons sitting nearby. She told me I was nothing but a freeloader showing up empty-handed to a luxury dinner just to eat for free. The humiliation burned in my chest, but I kept my face entirely neutral. I looked across the table at Spencer, expecting him to perhaps ease the tension, but instead he leaned back in his chair and chuckled. He swirled the expensive wine in his glass and looked at me with a patronizing smirk. He boasted that his investment firm was currently funding this entire lavish lifestyle and that I should be grateful they even allowed me to pull up a chair at their table. He proudly proclaimed that he was happy to treat his in-laws to the best anniversary dinner money could buy, but that charity cases like me needed to learn their place. He said that people who do not contribute to the family finances should not expect to enjoy the fruits of his hard labor. The absolute audacity of his statement was staggering. Spencer was sitting there playing the role of the generous millionaire provider, while looking down on me like I was a peasant begging for scraps. He told me that if I wanted to eat luxury food, I should have worked harder in life instead of settling for mediocrity. He laughed again and told Vanessa to go ahead and take the biggest lobster tail because she was the wife of the man paying the bills. The sheer arrogance radiating from them was suffocating. I sat frozen not because I was intimidated, but because I was calculating my next move. I had spent my entire life dealing with their condescension and their desperate need to feel superior to me. But tonight, the disrespect had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. I slowly turned my gaze away from Spencer and looked directly at my parents, Brenda and Jerome. A small part of me, the part that still remembered being a little girl, hoping for her parents' protection, waited for them to intervene. I waited for my mother to scold Vanessa for her terrible manners or for my father to tell Spencer to show some respect. Instead, the reality of my family dynamic struck me with full force. My mother, Brenda, took a delicate sip of her sparkling water and offered me a condescending smile. She reached over and patted Vanessa on the shoulder approvingly. Then she looked at me and delivered a line that I will never forget for the rest of my life. She told me that real family comes first, and that family members who do not contribute anything of value should not expect to be fed. She said that Vanessa and Spencer were the pillars of our family, and that I needed to stop acting so entitled to their generosity. She literally told her own daughter that I was unworthy of eating a meal because I supposedly did not have the money to foot the bill. The betrayal stung sharply, but I kept my breathing even. Then my father Jerome decided to join the execution. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and let out a heavy sigh of disappointment. He looked at me with absolute contempt and told me that this entire embarrassing situation could have been avoided if I had just listened to him 5 years ago. He reminded the table that he had arranged for me to work as an administrative assistant at Spencer's investment firm. He mocked my current career, calling me a glorified office janitor because I worked in corporate liquidations and restructuring. He told me that if I had just swallowed my pride and taken the assistant job under Spencer, I might actually have some money in my bank account today. He laughed and said I was spending my days cleaning up garbage from bankrupt companies while my sister was living like royalty. He said it was entirely my fault that I was sitting at a high society dinner acting like a starving beggar. The depth of their delusion was almost comical. They truly believed that Spencer was a financial genius and that I was a struggling failure who needed their pity. They had no idea about the grueling hours I had spent building my career. They did not know that I was a senior partner at a massive private equity firm specializing in mergers and acquisitions. They did not know that the glorified office janitor was actually the person who bought and sold companies worth hundreds of millions of dollars. They were so blinded by their worship of Spencer's fake old money aesthetic and Vanessa's country club status that they had completely written me off. The echo chamber of their arrogance bounced around the table as they all nodded in agreement, sharing a collective moment of superiority at my expense. They had officially chosen their side, and they had chosen the illusion of wealth over their own flesh and blood. For a long moment, the only sound at the table was the clinking of silverware as Vanessa smugly cut into her lobster tail. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice or throw a glass of water in anyone's face. I simply sat there and let the profound clarity of the moment wash over me. The toxic ties that had bound me to these people for 3 decades finally snapped, and the release felt incredibly empowering. I picked up my linen napkin and carefully wiped the corners of my mouth. I placed the napkin neatly beside my empty plate and pushed my chair back. I stood up tall, smoothing out the wrinkles in my sapphire blue dress. The table fell silent as they watched me, expecting me to throw a tantrum or run out crying. Instead, I looked at my mother and smiled a cold, genuine smile. I told her that she was absolutely right. I said that real family truly does pay their own way, and that it was time for everyone at this table to stand on their own 2 feet. I looked at Spencer and told him I hope he enjoys paying for the rest of his lifestyle. Then I picked up my designer coat and my clutch. I did not say another word. I turned on my heels and walked out of the private dining room, the sound of my stilettos clicking rhythmically against the imported marble floors. As I stepped out into the crisp Atlanta night air, I felt a massive weight lift from my shoulders. I walked straight to my waiting chauffeured Cadillac Escalade and instructed my driver to take me home. Back inside the restaurant, the scene I left behind was about to turn into a nightmare for my family. Exactly 5 minutes after my departure, the restaurant manager approached their table carrying a black leather folder. He placed the heavy folder directly in front of Spencer with a very serious expression. Spencer laughed, boasting that the bill had finally arrived and reaching for his wallet to play the big spender. He opened the folder and his arrogant smile instantly vanished. The total printed at the bottom of the receipt was $18,500. The manager cleared his throat and announced in a clear voice that the woman in the blue dress who had just left had contacted the front desk. He informed the stunned family that she had officially canceled the anonymous Black American Express card authorization that had been placed on file to cover the entire anniversary party. The manager stated that she requested the bill be handed directly to the gentleman who claimed to be funding the lifestyle. The blood completely drained from Spencer's face. Vanessa gasped, and my parents stared at the bill in absolute horror. The illusion was shattered. The free ride was over, and the glorified office janitor had just handed them the tab for their own arrogance. Spencer stared at the small piece of black leather, resting on the white tablecloth, as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. The heavy silence in the private dining room was only broken by the soft classical music playing from the hidden speakers in the ceiling. Vanessa was the first to find her voice. She demanded to know what the manager was talking about and insisted that there must be some sort of massive mistake. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the manager and shrilly declared that her husband was a very important man in the Atlanta investment community and that they did not appreciate being the subject of a tasteless prank. The restaurant manager, a seasoned professional who had catered to politicians and celebrities for over 20 years, did not even blink. He maintained a perfectly neutral expression and politely reiterated that there was no mistake. He explained that the reservation had been originally secured with a Black American Express card belonging to the woman who had just departed. Since she had revoked her authorization for the final charges, the establishment required a new method of payment before the party could leave the premises. My father, Jerome, shifted uncomfortably in his padded chair and looked at Spencer. He tried to force a jovial laugh, slapping his son-in-law on the shoulder and saying that this was just my typical dramatic behavior. He told Spencer to just hand the man his corporate card so they could put this unpleasantness behind them and go enjoy some after-dinner cigars at the country club. My mother, Brenda, nodded enthusiastically, completely oblivious to the sheer panic that was currently paralyzing her golden son-in-law. She smoothed down her silk napkin and added that it was honestly for the best, because they did not need my negative energy ruining such a beautiful anniversary milestone anyway. Spencer swallowed hard. A thick bead of sweat formed at his temple, catching the light of the crystal chandelier above us. He reached into his tailored suit jacket with trembling fingers and pulled out a heavy metal credit card. He handed it to the manager with a forced smile, attempting to regain his composure. He cleared his throat and told the manager to put the entire $18,500 on that card and to add a 20% tip for the inconvenience. Vanessa immediately beamed with pride, looking at her parents as if to say that her husband was the ultimate savior. The manager took the card, bowed slightly, and walked over to the portable payment terminal resting on a nearby serving cart. The seconds stretched into an excruciating eternity. Spencer picked up his wine glass, but his hand was shaking so badly that the rich red liquid spilled over the rim and stained the pristine white tablecloth. He quickly set it down, pretending it was just a clumsy mistake, but the absolute terror in his eyes was undeniable. The machine beeped a sharp, flat tone that cut through the thick tension. The manager looked at the screen, frowned slightly, and ran the card again. Another flat beep echoed in the quiet room. The manager turned back to the table, holding the metal card between his fingers. He apologized and stated that the card had been declined by the issuer. Vanessa scoffed loudly, crossing her arms over her chest. She told the manager that his payment machine was clearly broken because that was a premium corporate account with an unlimited balance. Spencer quickly jumped in, his voice noticeably an octave higher than usual. He stammered that his bank must have put a fraud alert on the account because of the unusually large dinner charge late in the evening. He frantically dug into his expensive leather wallet and pulled out another credit card. this one a standard platinum reward card, and shoved it toward the manager. He commanded him to just run the second one instead, and they would sort out the ridiculous fraud alert with his wealth manager in the morning. The manager accepted the second card with a tight nod. He slid it into the machine and waited. A beep sounded indicating it was declined. The manager tried a third time with the exact same result. The atmosphere in the dining room shifted from tense to utterly humiliating. The manager walked back to the table and placed both cards down in front of Spencer. He leaned in slightly, keeping his voice low but firm. He informed Spencer that both cards were returning a code for insufficient funds and frozen accounts, not a fraud alert. He asked if there was another form of payment the family would like to provide immediately. The facade finally began to crack, and it shattered beautifully. Vanessa turned pale, looking at her husband in absolute shock. She demanded he explain what was going on and why his cards were bouncing. Spencer refused to look at her, keeping his eyes glued to the empty lobster shells on his plate. He muttered something incomprehensible about a temporary liquidity issue and a wire transfer that had not cleared in time for the weekend. My father, Jerome, realizing the severe gravity of the situation, felt his chest tighten with anxiety. He reached for his own wallet but quickly stopped himself. My parents had retired 3 years ago and lived entirely on a fixed income that could never cover an $18,000 dinner bill in a single swipe. By now, the loud commotion had attracted the attention of the other wealthy patrons in the restaurant. The dining room was not a large establishment, and the tables were close enough that the wealthy elite of Atlanta had a front-row seat to the spectacle. The mayor of the city was dining 2 tables away, and several prominent real estate developers, whom Spencer had always desperately tried to impress, were watching the scene unfold with barely concealed amusement. The whispers began to ripple through the dining room. People were pointing and murmuring behind their expensive wine glasses, realizing that the flashy couple who had been incredibly loud all evening could not even afford their own extravagant meal. The manager, having lost his professional patience with the situation, stood tall and crossed his arms. He informed the table that if a valid payment method could not be produced within the next 10 minutes, he would have no choice but to contact the local authorities to report a massive theft of services. The threat of police involvement hung in the air like a heavy dark cloud. The idea of the police arriving at the most exclusive restaurant in the city to arrest my parents and sister on their 40th anniversary was the ultimate nightmare for a family that completely worships social standing and community reputation. My mother Brenda began to hyperventilate. She clutched her chest, tears welling in her eyes as the harsh reality of their public humiliation set in. She looked at Spencer, begging him to do something to call his bank or call a rich friend. But Spencer just sat there completely defeated, his arrogant posture entirely deflated. When it became clear that no magical funds were going to appear, the manager suggested a highly unorthodox alternative to avoid a terrible police scene. He looked directly at the heavy diamond necklace resting against my mother's collarbone. He stated that the restaurant would be willing to hold an item of significant value as collateral until the bill was settled in full the following morning. The absolute devastation on my mother's face was a masterpiece. She slowly reached up with shaking hands and unclasped the diamond necklace that my father had bought her 10 years ago during better financial times. It was her most prized possession, the very symbol of her status and wealth. She handed it to the restaurant manager while sobbing quietly into her hands. Vanessa hid her face in her napkin too, ashamed to look at the powerful people staring at them from the neighboring tables. Spencer kept his head down as the manager handed them a temporary receipt for the collateral and told them they were free to leave the premises. The 4 of them had to perform the ultimate walk of shame through the crowded restaurant exiting the building, with their heads hung low, stripped of every ounce of pride they had walked in with. While my family was experiencing the most degrading moment of their lives, I was sinking into the plush leather seats of my chauffeured Cadillac Escalade. The bright city lights of Atlanta blurred past the tinted windows as my driver navigated through the heavy evening traffic. The silence inside the cabin was luxurious and peaceful. My phone resting on the center console began to vibrate violently. The screen lit up with back-to-back incoming calls. First, it was my mother, then Vanessa, then my father, and then Spencer. The calls kept coming, followed by a relentless flood of frantic text messages demanding to know where I was and screaming at me for what I had just done. I did not answer a single one. I simply reached over, pressed the silent button, and turned the phone face down on the leather seat. I opened the small refrigerated compartment between the seats and pulled out a chilled bottle of premium champagne. I popped the cork, the soft hiss filling the quiet car, and poured myself a generous glass. I took a slow, deliberate sip, savoring the taste of absolute freedom. They had spent my entire life calling me a failure, mocking my career, and treating me like I was a heavy burden who contributed nothing to the family legacy. They genuinely believed I was just a lowly administrative worker cleaning up messes in a boring corporate office somewhere. They had no idea who I actually was or what I really did for a living every single day. The truth was that I was a senior partner at one of the most ruthless private equity firms on the East Coast. My official title was Mergers and Acquisitions Liquidator. I did not clean up office trash. I cleaned up massive corporate disasters. When giant companies went bankrupt or severely mismanaged their funds, my firm swooped in, bought their toxic debt for pennies on the dollar, and I was the one who ruthlessly dismantled their assets to turn a huge profit. I spent my days in high-stakes boardrooms crushing arrogant executives who thought they were invincible. Exactly the kind of men Spencer pretended to be to impress my superficial parents. For the past 5 years, I had been the invisible benefactor secretly funding my family's grand illusions of wealth. When my father made a terrible investment that nearly wiped out their retirement savings, I was the one who secretly created the anonymous trust that bought their debt and kept them from losing their house. When Vanessa wanted a lavish wedding that Spencer absolutely could not afford, I was the one who quietly funneled money into their accounts through a dummy corporation just to keep my mother from having a nervous breakdown over the potential social embarrassment. I had paid for their vacations, their luxury cars, and their extravagant dinners all from the shadows. I had absorbed their cruel insults and their endless condescension because I foolishly believed that protecting my parents' fragile pride was my duty as a loving daughter. I had convinced myself that keeping them comfortable was much more important than demanding their basic respect. But sitting in the back of the car watching the tiny bubbles rise in my champagne glass, I realized that my quiet charity had only bred their deep contempt. By shielding them from the harsh consequences of their own financial incompetence, I had allowed them to build a towering ego based on a foundation of absolute lies. They truly thought Spencer was their wealthy savior, and I was their biggest embarrassment. But the Black American Express card I had just canceled was the only thing standing between them and total financial ruin. I took another sip of my champagne, feeling a cold, calculated calm wash over my entire body. I was entirely done being the family punching bag. I was done subsidizing the fake lifestyle of a sister who hated me and a brother-in-law who blatantly disrespected me. They wanted to know what real family meant. They wanted to preach to me about paying their own way. Now they were going to learn exactly how harsh the real world is when the invisible safety net is violently ripped away. The free ride had officially ended, and the liquidator had just clocked in for work. The morning sun rose over Atlanta, casting a humid and unforgiving light on the city. But for my mother, Brenda, and my sister Vanessa, the new day brought absolutely no warmth. They were entirely consumed by the burning humiliation of the previous night. Spencer had spent the entire car ride home sweating and stammering through a convoluted web of excuses about offshore bank accounts, frozen wire transfers, and malicious corporate sabotage. My parents had swallowed every single lie because the alternative, admitting their golden son-in-law was a broke fraud, was simply too devastating for their fragile egos to handle. Instead, they redirected every ounce of their venom toward the easiest target they knew, which was me. They convinced themselves that my actions at the restaurant were a calculated, malicious attack born out of deep-seated jealousy. Fueled by this shared delusion, Brenda and Vanessa marched out of my parents' house early the next morning, determined to confront me and demand an immediate apology. Vanessa aggressively gripped the steering wheel of her leased Porsche Cayenne, navigating the heavy morning traffic toward the gritty industrial outskirts of the city. They were heading to a rundown apartment complex nestled between a noisy highway overpass and a failing strip mall. It was the exact same cramped one-bedroom unit I had rented right after I graduated from college when I was working 8-0-hour weeks and eating instant noodles just to survive. My family had only visited me there exactly one time, complaining loudly about the neighborhood the entire time. They simply assumed I was still trapped in that miserable place because in their minds, I was completely incapable of ever moving up in the world. Vanessa swerved the Porsche into the cracked asphalt parking lot, wrinkling her nose in disgust at the overflowing dumpsters and the faded paint peeling off the apartment buildings. Brenda clutched her designer purse tightly against her chest, stepping out of the vehicle and immediately complaining about the smell of stale garbage and cheap laundry detergent lingering in the humid air. They stomped up the 3 flights of concrete stairs, the sharp clicking of their heels echoing loudly through the open breezeway. Vanessa marched right up to unit number 312, and began pounding her fist aggressively against the chipped wooden door. She yelled my name through the cheap wood, demanding that I open the door immediately and face the consequences of my embarrassing temper tantrum from the night before. They stood there for several minutes, taking turns aggressively banging on the door and shouting empty threats. They promised to drag my name through the mud and cut me off from the family forever, completely ignoring the irony that I had already happily cut myself off. Their loud commotion eventually attracted the attention of a gruff, elderly man holding a clipboard who was walking down the breezeway. It was Mr. Hendricks, the building manager, who had owned the property for 20 years. He glared at the two wealthy women causing a scene on his property and sharply asked them what on earth they thought they were doing, pounding on his tenant's door at 8:00 the morning. Brenda immediately puffed up her chest, putting on her best country club voice, and haughtily informed the man that they were looking for Deandra. She commanded the manager to use his master key to open the door because she was my mother, and she had an urgent family matter to discuss. Mr. Hendricks stared at them blankly, letting out a dry, raspy laugh that completely dismissed their false authority. He shook his head and bluntly informed them that nobody named Deandra lived in that unit anymore. Vanessa rolled her eyes, insisting that the manager must be mistaken because her sister was a lazy failure who could never afford to live anywhere else. Mr. Hendricks crossed his arms over his chest and looked at them with a mixture of annoyance and pity. He stated very clearly that he remembered me perfectly well because I was the best tenant he ever had, but that I had completely bought out the remainder of my lease and moved away exactly 4 years ago. He added that I had handed him a certified cashier's check, packed my minimal belongings into a moving truck, and left without leaving any forwarding address whatsoever. The absolute shock that washed over Brenda and Vanessa's faces was a picture of pure poetic justice. Their mouths hung open as the reality of his words slowly sank in. They stood in the middle of a dirty concrete walkway, realizing that they had spent the last 4 years mocking a version of my life that did not even exist anymore. They had absolutely no idea where I lived, what I did, or who I had become. Enraged and deeply embarrassed by their useless trip, Vanessa stormed back down the stairs to her car with Brenda trailing closely behind her. The realization that they could not physically corner me and scream in my face only made Vanessa more volatile. As she sat in the driver's seat gripping the steering wheel, her embarrassment rapidly mutated into a desperate need to control the public narrative before the elite circles of Atlanta found out about their humiliating exit from the restaurant. The society they worshipped ran entirely on gossip, and Vanessa knew that the waiters and the neighboring tables from last night would soon start whispering about Spencer's declined credit cards and my mother's pawned diamond necklace. She needed a scapegoat, and she needed one immediately. Vanessa pulled down the sun visor, adjusted the mirror, and carefully fixed her makeup to ensure she looked appropriately distressed, but still beautifully flawless. She pulled out her phone, attached a small portable ring light, and opened her Instagram and Facebook applications. She specifically targeted the private high society Facebook groups where the wealthy housewives, local politicians, and country club members gossiped daily. She hit the record button, taking a deep, trembling breath to artificially produce tears in her eyes. She began her video with a dramatic sigh, looking straight into the camera and playing the role of the heartbroken, incredibly betrayed sibling. She told her thousands of followers that she normally never posted about private family matters, but that her heart was simply shattered into a million pieces today. She explicitly named me, calling me her bitter, estranged sister who had always struggled with intense jealousy issues. Vanessa spun a masterful web of lies, claiming that my parents had generously invited me to their private luxury anniversary dinner out of the pure kindness of their hearts, trying to help a struggling relative. She stared into the lens and wiped a fake tear away, stating that instead of being grateful, I had thrown a violent public tantrum because I was entirely envious of Spencer's immense wealth and success. She went on to tell the camera that I was a broke, desperate thief who had intentionally tried to ruin a beautiful family milestone out of pure spite. She vaguely alluded to the bill, claiming that I had tried to pull a cruel financial scam at the restaurant before running away into the night like a coward. She begged her followers for prayers during this incredibly difficult time, asking them to send love to her poor mother, who was supposedly bedridden with grief over my toxic behavior. Brenda even leaned over from the passenger seat, her face looking intentionally solemn and weary, playing the part of the battered matriarch who had sacrificed everything for an ungrateful child. Within minutes, the notifications began pouring in. The comment section of the videos flooded with fake sympathy and absolute outrage from the Atlanta elite. Women who had never even met me were commenting about how disgusting my behavior was and how Vanessa and Spencer were saints for even trying to include me in their lavish lifestyle. Vanessa sat in the parking lot reading the comments aloud to Brenda, feeling a massive surge of validation and power. She smiled smugly, genuinely believing that she had successfully assassinated my character and protected her husband's fake empire from scrutiny. She thought she had buried me alive in the court of public opinion, completely unaware that she was only digging her own grave much, much deeper. Miles away from that filthy parking lot and the frantic social media lies, the morning sunlight was streaming through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of my sanctuary. I slowly opened my eyes to the breathtaking panoramic view of the Buckhead skyline stretching out beneath me. I was lying in a massive California king bed, wrapped in imported silk sheets that felt like cool water against my skin. There was no screaming, no panic, and absolutely no anxiety. The air in my $4 million penthouse was perfectly climate-controlled and utterly silent, save for the soft hum of the smart home system, quietly adjusting the automated blinds to let the natural morning light filter into the massive space. I stretched my arms out, taking a moment to simply exist in the peaceful luxury that I had built with my own two bare hands. I walked barefoot across the heated marble floors of my master suite, making my way to the open-concept kitchen that belonged on the cover of an Architectural Digest magazine. I stood in front of my high-end Italian espresso machine, listening to the comforting grinding of the fresh beans and watching the dark, rich coffee pour into my cup. I leaned against the massive quartz kitchen island, picking up my phone to check my morning briefings. My digital footprint was carefully monitored by a private security firm, but I still kept anonymous accounts to keep track of the local business and social developments. It took exactly 2 swipes for me to find Vanessa's tearful, dramatic videos circulating through the internet. I took a slow sip of my hot espresso, letting the bitter, rich flavor coat my tongue as I watched my sister perform her absolute heart out for the camera. I did not feel an ounce of anger or sadness as she called me a broke, bitter thief. Instead, a soft, genuine laugh escaped my lips, echoing through the empty luxury of my kitchen. The pure, delicious irony of a woman drowning in massive secret debt, sitting in a leased car, calling me broke from a filthy parking lot was almost too perfect for words. I watched Brenda's sad face in the background and simply shook my head at their pathetic predictability. I analyzed their psychological play with the cold detachment of an apex predator watching its prey thrash around in a trap. They were utterly terrified. The videos were not an attack. They were a desperate, panicked defense mechanism. Vanessa was screaming into the internet because it was the only place she still had any illusion of control. They needed the public to believe I was crazy because the alternative was the public realizing that Spencer could not afford to buy a glass of water without his credit cards bouncing. I set the phone down on the marble counter, not bothering to reply, comment, or defend myself. True power does not need to argue with desperate lies. True power simply waits for the execution. A soft chime echoed through the penthouse, indicating that my private elevator had reached my floor. The heavy polished doors slid open, revealing my personal concierge and executive assistant, Elias. He was dressed in a sharp-tailored suit, holding a sleek black velvet box in his gloved hands. Elias walked into the kitchen, offering me a polite professional nod. He placed the velvet box gently onto the quartz counter right next to my espresso cup. He informed me that the transaction had been completely finalized according to my exact instructions from the previous night. He had gone directly to the restaurant management team the moment their doors opened this morning, and he had paid the $18,500 bill in full using my corporate account. I reached out and slowly opened the lid of the velvet box. Resting on a bed of dark satin was the heavy diamond necklace that my father had bought for my mother 10 years ago. The exact same necklace she had tearfully handed over to the restaurant manager as collateral to avoid being arrested for theft of services. It sparkled brilliantly under the recessed lighting of my kitchen, looking both beautiful and incredibly pathetic at the same time. I did not buy it back out of any lingering sense of familial love or hidden affection for my mother. There no warmth in my chest as I stared at the diamonds. I had bought the necklace back because it was a tangible symbol of their complete and utter submission. It was a receipt of their failure and a physical reminder that their entire existence was now entirely at my mercy. I picked up the cold, heavy jewelry, letting the diamonds run through my fingers like small, sharp stones. They had mocked me, insulted my career, and told me that real family pays their own way. Now, I literally owned the most valuable thing my mother possessed, and I had purchased their freedom without them even realizing it yet. I placed the necklace back into the velvet box, snapping the lid shut with a sharp, definitive click. I handed the box back to Elias, instructing him to place it securely inside my hidden wall safe. The smear campaign on social media meant absolutely nothing to me now. Vanessa could have all the fake sympathy in the world, but I held the keys to their actual reality, and the real game had not even started yet. An hour later, my driver pulled the massive Cadillac Escalade up to the sweeping glass entrance of my corporate headquarters, located in the very heart of Midtown Atlanta. The towering skyscraper reflected the bright morning sun like a massive glowing beacon of financial dominance. I stepped out of the luxury vehicle and walked through the spinning revolving doors, feeling the familiar and intoxicating shift in the atmosphere that always accompanied my arrival at the firm. The lively morning chatter in the vast marble lobby immediately hushed to a respectful whisper as employees quickly stepped aside to clear a wide path for my approach. I did not ever have to demand respect in this towering building because my ruthless reputation preceded me everywhere I went. I stepped into my private express elevator and swiped my encrypted access card, heading straight for the top floor where the senior partners operated in absolute silence and power. Today started out just like any other busy day with a highly aggressive high-stakes meeting in the main executive boardroom. I walked into the massive glass-walled room where 5 heavily perspiring executives from a failing logistics startup were sitting nervously around a polished mahogany table. They had spent the entire last hour pitching my team of junior analysts desperately trying to secure a multi-million-dollar bailout package to save their rapidly sinking company. They were all wearing incredibly expensive designer suits and sporting flashy luxury watches they could clearly no longer afford, desperately clinging to the fading illusion of their corporate success. I took my seat at the head of the long table and did not even bother to open the glossy presentation folders they had prepared for me. I looked directly at their chief executive officer, a loud, arrogant man who reminded me entirely too much of Spencer with his unearned confidence and completely empty promises. I spoke very softly, but my voice carried the absolute finality of a judge delivering a fatal sentence. I recited their actual devastating financial metrics completely, from memory, breaking down their bloated executive salaries, their massive unnecessary overhead costs, and their completely unsustainable cash flow burn rate. I watched the color completely drain from their faces as I systematically dismantled their entire fragile business model in less than 10 minutes. The chief executive officer tried to interrupt me, stammering wildly about projected fourth-quarter growth and upcoming unverified contracts that would supposedly save them. I raised a single hand, silencing his desperate rambling instantly. I calmly informed him that my private equity firm was absolutely not a charity, and that we were not in the business of funding corporate delusions for failing men. I told them with cold precision that their company was officially dead, and that I was acquiring their toxic debt strictly to liquidate their remaining physical assets and sell them off for parts. One of the startup founders began to quietly weep, putting his head in his shaking hands as the crushing reality of his total financial ruin finally set in. I felt absolutely no pity for them or their tears. In my specific line of work, emotions are considered a severe liability. My job is to seek out financial rot, to carve out the diseased tissue of bad investments, and to extract maximum profit from the broken bones left behind. I instructed my ruthless legal team to immediately draft the final liquidation agreements, and I walked out of the boardroom, leaving the ruined executives sitting in a silent graveyard of their own making. This was my kingdom, and this was where I truly thrived. I was an apex predator in an ocean of corporate sharks, and I had spent the last decade sharpening my teeth on men exactly like them. I returned to my massive corner office, where the floor-to-ceiling glass windows offered an unobstructed panoramic view of the sprawling Atlanta skyline. My office was a perfect sanctuary of minimalist luxury, decorated in dark, rich wood and brushed steel, reflecting the cold, unyielding precision with which I conducted all my business affairs. I stood by the window for a long moment, watching the tiny cars moving slowly on the highway far below, completely disconnected from the messy, petty human drama happening down at the ground level. I thought briefly about my mother and sisters screaming their pathetic lies into their cell phones in a dirty parking lot miles away, and the stark contrast between our two lives felt almost cinematic in its perfection. A gentle knock on the heavy oak door pulled me away from my deep thoughts. My executive assistant, Elias, stepped into the room holding a thick, bright red folder. In our aggressive firm, a red folder meant a highly volatile, distressed asset that required immediate senior partner intervention. Elias walked over to my polished desk, and placed the heavy file right in the center, resting it perfectly square. He informed me that our firm had just completed a massive bulk acquisition of bad debt from a failing regional bank earlier that exact morning. The struggling bank had been quietly offloading their absolute worst-performing commercial loans at a steep discount just to clear their toxic books before an upcoming federal financial audit. Elias explained that this particular portfolio had been flagged by our highly advanced risk assessment algorithm due to an extreme default probability and multiple glaring signs of severe financial mismanagement. I took my seat in my high-back leather chair and pulled the red folder closer to me. I asked Elias what corporate sector the portfolio belonged to, assuming it was just another bloated tech startup or a mismanaged commercial real estate firm that had foolishly over-leveraged its properties. Elias maintained his perfect professional composure, but I noticed a very slight hesitation in his posture before he spoke. He stated that it was a boutique investment and wealth management group that catered heavily to the local Atlanta elite. He carefully added that the primary guarantor of the massive debt seemed to be highly active in the exact same local social circles that my family frequently associated with. I flipped open the heavy cardboard cover and looked at the bold black letters printed at the very top of the executive summary page. My heart completely stopped beating in my chest. The cool, conditioned air in my spacious office suddenly felt very thin, and the ambient noise of the bustling city outside vanished into absolute dead silence. The company name staring back at me in stark black ink was Spencer Holdings. The sheer, utter impossibility of the moment washed over me, making me genuinely wonder if I was suffering from a vivid, stress-induced hallucination. The universe works in incredibly mysterious and profound ways, but this level of perfect poetic alignment felt almost terrifying to witness. Atlanta was a massive, sprawling metropolis, but the exclusive circle of high society elite was actually an incredibly small and incestuous pond. Everyone borrowed money from everyone else, and the fake wealth ecosystem was constantly cannibalizing itself to survive another day. Spencer had apparently borrowed millions upon millions of dollars from a regional bank that had ultimately failed, and subsequently sold all of his bad debt to my specific firm. The very firm where the so-called glorified office janitor happened to be the senior partner in absolute charge of liquidating toxic assets. I stared at his name printed on the legal documents for several long minutes, feeling a strange mixture of awe and absolute predatory excitement building rapidly in my chest. I dismissed Elias, instructing him to hold all of my incoming phone calls and completely cancel all of my afternoon meetings because I needed to personally conduct an immediate and thorough deep dive into this specific financial portfolio. As the heavy office door clicked shut, leaving me entirely alone, I leaned forward and began to turn the pages of my brother-in-law's impending doom. What I uncovered over the next 3 grueling hours was a financial bloodbath of truly epic proportions. I traced every single desperate line of credit, every hidden wire transfer, and every blatantly falsified asset declaration he had ever submitted. The vast mountain of documents painted a vivid and pathetic picture of a man who was desperately drowning in a sea of his own fraudulent illusions. Spencer was absolutely not old money, as he so proudly loved to claim to anyone who would listen. The detailed background check attached to the back of the file revealed that his family trust fund had completely run dry over 7 years ago, severely depleted by his parents' own bad investments and their lavish, irresponsible spending habits. Spencer had inherited absolutely nothing but a recognizable last name and a desperate, ravenous hunger to maintain his country club status at all costs. He was running what was essentially a Ponzi-light scheme right under the arrogant noses of the Atlanta elite. He had been using the incoming investment capital from new clueless clients to quietly pay off the guaranteed monthly returns of his older, increasingly angry clients. He had no actual portfolio growth, no successful real estate developments, and absolutely no legitimate revenue streams generating actual profit. He was just frantically moving invisible money from one sinking bucket to another, trying desperately to keep the massive charade going long enough to secure the next naive investor at the golf course. The cold, hard numbers were completely staggering. Spencer Holdings was currently drowning in exactly $12 million of highly toxic, completely unrecoverable debt. He had foolishly leveraged every single thing he owned, including his luxury German cars, his expensive country club memberships, and the fake commercial office space he rented in the downtown business district. He was entirely bankrupt in every possible sense of the word, and the regional bank had been preparing to aggressively seize all of his remaining assets before they went under and transferred the debt to my ruthless firm. I continued flipping through the heavy stack of legal documents, shaking my head at the absolute absurdity of his severe financial incompetence. And then I turned to the final section labeled External Collateral and Secured Personal Guarantees. My eyes scanned the attached property deeds and complex legal filings, and my breath caught sharply in my throat. My hands began to tremble slightly, not from any lingering sadness, but from the sheer overwhelming magnitude of the betrayal I was currently reading. Attached securely to Spencer's massive pile of toxic commercial debt was a residential warranty deed and a secondary mortgage lien. It was for a large, sprawling property located in one of the most affluent, quiet suburbs in the entire city. It was my parents' fully paid-off home, the grand house they had lived in for 30 years. The house where I grew up. The house they constantly bragged to their friends about owning absolutely free and clear. Spencer had secretly mortgaged my parents' entire property to secure an emergency line of credit to keep his failing fraudulent company afloat for just a few more pathetic months. I stared blankly at the ink signatures at the very bottom of the lien document. My father, Jerome, and my mother, Brenda, had both proudly signed the legal documents, completely signing away their most valuable asset to their golden white son-in-law. I knew exactly how Spencer had managed to pull this horrific scam off. He must have fed them some complicated, confusing lie about a temporary tax loophole or a brilliant real estate investment strategy requiring their signatures as a mere corporate formality. My parents were so deeply blinded by their absolute worship of his perceived status and so desperate to secure their prominent place in his wealthy inner circle that they had eagerly signed over the literal roof over their heads without ever bothering to read the fine print. They had willingly handed their entire life over to a lying fraud who was currently $12 million in the red. And the most beautiful, terrifying part of this entire discovery was the strict legal reality of what it meant for me right now. By purchasing this distressed portfolio, my private equity firm had just become the sole legal owner of Spencer's entire massive debt. I was the senior partner holding full absolute executive authority over this specific corporate account. I slowly closed the bright red folder and leaned back in my soft leather chair, staring up at the immaculate ceiling of my corner office. I did not just hold the massive power to completely destroy Spencer's fake empire. I now legally held the very keys to my parents' home, and I was officially their ultimate unforgiving creditor. The woman they called a glorified janitor had just been handed the exact legal tools needed to permanently dismantle every single lie my family had ever told. 2 days after I uncovered the catastrophic truth buried inside that red folder, my personal cell phone buzzed with an incoming text message. It was from my mother, Brenda. The message was sickeningly sweet, completely overflowing with fake affection and heart emojis, asking if her youngest daughter had time to meet for a quick cup of coffee to catch up. She suggested a highly exclusive European-style cafe located right in the middle of Buckhead, known for its $20 lattes and discreet, private booths. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, feeling a cold, calculated amusement spreading through my chest. I knew exactly what this sudden, out-of-character invitation really meant. They wanted something from me. The smear campaign that Vanessa had launched on social media was still actively burning through the Atlanta elite circles, painting me as a jealous, broke villain, while Spencer continued to play the wealthy victim. My parents had completely supported those vicious public lies. Yet here was my mother texting me, as if we were just two best friends meeting for a casual morning chat. I instructed Elias to clear an hour from my afternoon schedule, and I sent a brief, one-word reply confirming I would be there. I deliberately chose to wear a sharply tailored charcoal gray business suit, a silent visual reminder of the corporate power they constantly refused to acknowledge. My driver dropped me off right at the front entrance of the cafe, and I walked inside, letting my eyes adjust to the dim, warm lighting. The rich smell of roasted espresso beans and fresh pastries filled the air, blending with the expensive perfumes of the wealthy patrons. I spotted Brenda and Jerome immediately sitting in a velvet-lined booth in the very back corner. They had clearly dressed to impress, wearing their finest country club attire, desperately clinging to the illusion of their high society status. As I approached the table, my mother stood up and pulled me into a suffocatingly tight embrace, kissing the air right next to my cheek. She loudly exclaimed how absolutely wonderful I looked, and how much she had missed seeing my beautiful face. My father, Jerome, actually stood up and pulled out my chair for me, flashing a wide, perfectly practiced smile that did not reach his cold eyes. I sat down, ordering a simple black coffee from the passing waiter, keeping my posture perfectly rigid and professional. They immediately launched into a bizarre, overly enthusiastic conversation about the beautiful weather and the latest meaningless gossip from their golf club. They completely ignored the massive elephant sitting right in the middle of the table. There was absolutely no mention of the explosive night at the restaurant. There was no mention of the $18,500 bill I had left them to pay. And there was certainly no mention of the terrible lies my sister was currently spreading about me all over the internet. They were performing a masterclass in aggressive gaslighting, acting as if the last 4 days simply had not happened. They smiled and laughed, sipping their sparkling water, trying to disarm me with a thick, suffocating layer of artificial parental warmth. I just sat there quietly drinking my dark coffee, waiting patiently for the inevitable trap to finally spring closed. After about 20 minutes of excruciatingly fake small, the conversation finally took the sharp, predetermined turn I had been waiting for. My father cleared his throat, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin, and adopted a serious, deeply paternal tone. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood table, and looked at me with an expression of profound manufactured patience. He told me that family is the most important thing in the world, and that sometimes family members have small disagreements that need to be forgiven and forgotten. He completely glossed over the severe public humiliation they had subjected me to and instead smoothly reframed the entire restaurant incident as just a silly little misunderstanding. My mother immediately chimed in, placing her hand gently over mine. She told me that they loved me very much and that they knew I deeply regretted causing such a terrible scene at their anniversary dinner. The sheer audacity required to suggest that I was the one who needed to apologize was staggering, but I kept my face completely blank, allowing them to dig their hole even deeper. Jerome reached down into his leather briefcase resting on the floor and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He placed it on the table between our coffee cups and slowly slid it across the smooth surface until it was resting directly in front of me. He offered a warm, reassuring smile and explained that Spencer and Vanessa were currently in the middle of closing a truly massive, highly lucrative real estate acquisition. He lied with absolute, flawless precision, telling me that Spencer's investment firm was simply moving so much liquid capital around that they had temporarily triggered a minor bureaucratic tax loophole. Jerome smoothly claimed that because of my complete lack of major assets and my low-profile administrative job, I was in the perfect legal position to help them out. He casually patted the top of the envelope and stated that it was just a routine administrative tax form, a minor family favor that would help Spencer bypass some annoying red tape with his accountants. Brenda squeezed my hand again, her eyes wide with fake sincerity. She leaned in close and whispered that signing this simple little document would be the absolute perfect way for me to apologize for my embarrassing behavior at the restaurant. She promised me that if I just did this one tiny favor for Spencer, Vanessa would completely forgive me, and we could all go back to being a happy, perfect family again. They were using a highly toxic combination of guilt manipulation and the desperate promise of their conditional love to try and force my hand. They truly believed I was incredibly stupid. They thought the little girl who used to beg for their approval was still sitting across from them, completely willing to jump through burning hoops just to earn a single scrap of their affection. My father even pulled an expensive fountain pen from his jacket pocket and placed it right next to the envelope, tapping the table impatiently. He told me to just quickly sign on the dotted lines marked with the yellow sticky notes so he could rush the paperwork back to Spencer's lawyers before the banks closed for the weekend. He said there was absolutely no need for me to bore myself reading all the complicated legal jargon because he had already personally reviewed everything and assured me it was entirely safe. The way they seamlessly tag-teamed the lie was almost impressive, proving that they had likely rehearsed this exact script multiple times before calling me. They wanted to blindside me with kindness, overwhelm me with family guilt, and rush me into signing away my life without asking any questions. I looked down at the thick stack of papers resting inside the envelope, feeling a dark, predatory thrill racing through my veins. I knew exactly what was inside that envelope before my fingers even touched the seal. I knew because I was the senior liquidator who currently owned the exact multi-million-dollar debt they were so desperately trying to outrun. I picked up the expensive fountain pen my father had provided and rolled it slowly between my fingers, feeling the heavy weight of the metal. My mother breathed a very audible sigh of absolute relief, wrongly assuming that my silence was a sign of total submission. She signaled to the waiter to bring the dessert menu, cheerfully announcing that we should order some rich chocolate cake to celebrate putting all of this ugly family drama behind us. Jerome smiled broadly, checking his luxury watch, and loudly declaring that Spencer was going to be so thrilled to hear that the little tax problem was finally resolved. They were already celebrating their successful manipulation, completely oblivious to the reality that the woman sitting across from them was no longer their naive little scapegoat, but rather the corporate executioner holding the axe over their necks. I placed the pen back down on the table, aligning it perfectly parallel to the manila envelope. I did not say a word as I slowly reached out and pulled the thick stack of legal documents out of the protective casing. My father immediately bristled, reaching out to stop my hand, but I shot him a glare so cold and authoritative that he physically recoiled into his side of the booth. I flipped past the cover page, completely ignoring the yellow sticky notes guiding me blindly to the signature lines. My eyes rapidly scanned the dense legal text, immediately identifying the predatory language buried deep within the paragraphs. Just as I had suspected, this was not a routine administrative tax form or a minor bureaucratic loophole. The document I was holding in my hands was an unconditional personal guarantee and a sweeping assumption of liability contract. If my pen had touched that paper, I would have instantly become legally and personally responsible for completely covering Spencer's massive $12 million corporate default. They were trying to chain me directly to the sinking anchor of his fraudulent empire. They were actively trying to completely destroy my entire financial future just to buy their fake golden son-in-law a few more months of breathing room. The sheer unadulterated evil of their plan was breathtaking. My own parents were happily willing to feed me to the wolves, offering me up as a human sacrifice on the altar of their country club reputation. I read the final clause, making sure I understood the absolute depths of their betrayal. And then I looked up. Brenda and Jerome were staring at me, their fake smiles beginning to slowly melt off their faces as they realized I was actually comprehending the complex legal jargon they thought I was too stupid to understand. A deep, genuine smile slowly spread across my face. It was not a happy smile, but rather the terrifying smile of a predator that had finally cornered its prey. I looked my father dead in his eyes, refusing to blink, refusing to look away. I firmly grasped the thick stack of heavy legal paper with both hands and slowly, deliberately tore the entire document directly down the middle. The loud, sharp sound of ripping paper echoed like a gunshot in the quiet, high-end cafe. My mother let out a shrill, horrified gasp, covering her mouth with her hands. My father jumped up slightly in his seat, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson as he demanded to know what on earth I thought I was doing, destroying a highly sensitive legal document. I did not answer him. I calmly took the two torn halves, stacked them together, and applied all of my strength to rip them directly in half again, tearing their desperate financial lifeline into useless, jagged quarters. I held my parents terrified gaze as I slowly opened my hand and let the thick, shredded pieces of the fraudulent contract drop directly into my half-empty cup of black coffee. The dark, hot liquid immediately soaked into the paper, ruining the ink and completely destroying any chance of the document ever being salvaged. They sat there completely paralyzed by shock, unable to process the absolute defiance of my actions. The quiet, submissive daughter they thought they knew was dead and gone. I reached into my designer suit pocket and pulled out a crisp $20 bill, placing it neatly on the table right next to my ruined coffee cup. I kept my voice dangerously low and perfectly composed as I told them that my coffee was paid for and that they should stop asking me to foot the bill for other people's mistakes. I stood up from the velvet booth, adjusting my jacket with calm precision. I looked down at their stunned, pale faces and told them that real family does not try to bankrupt their own children to save a lying fraud. I turned my back on them and walked out of the cafe, leaving them sitting in absolute, terrified silence, staring at a ruined cup of coffee that contained the shredded remains of their very last hope for survival. The heavy oak doors of the Buckhead coffee shop swung shut behind me, cutting off the suffocating atmosphere of my parents' desperate gaslighting. I walked out into the bright afternoon sun, feeling an intoxicating rush of absolute power. They thought they could trap me, but they had only handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy them. Miles away in a leased luxury office space that was currently 3 months behind on rent, Spencer was experiencing a very different kind of reality. The polished facade of his fake old money empire was rapidly crumbling around his perfectly manicured hands. Spencer sat behind his massive mahogany desk, staring blankly at the shredded pieces of the guarantor contract that his father-in-law had just frantically delivered. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and dangerously close to hyperventilating. He had banked his entire survival on my supposed stupidity and my desperate need for family approval. The realization that his perfect scapegoat had violently rejected the bait sent a shockwave of pure, unfiltered terror straight through his central nervous system. Vanessa paced the length of the extravagant office, her high heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She was completely oblivious to the massive $12 million debt that was currently suffocating her husband. She only saw the shredded paper as another personal attack from her jealous, bitter sister. Spencer watched her pace, his desperate mind working overtime to spin a new lie that would keep her completely blind to his impending bankruptcy. He could not let her know that the country club lifestyle, the designer bags, and the luxury cars were all funded by an intricate web of toxic fraud. Spencer stood up, walking over to Vanessa and pulling her into a tight, rehearsed embrace. He kissed the top of her head, adopting a tone of deep, sorrowful victimhood. He whispered that I was clearly deeply disturbed and that my refusal to sign the simple tax form was a malicious attempt to sabotage their incredible success. He expertly played on Vanessa's deep-seated insecurities, convincing her that I was entirely consumed by toxic jealousy. He smoothly claimed that my actions were a targeted, deliberate attempt to destroy their beautiful black excellence because I could not stand seeing them thrive while I supposedly struggled in mediocrity. Vanessa leaned into his manipulation, swallowing the poisonous narrative without a single moment of hesitation. She completely bought into the idea that she and Spencer were the shining, untouchable stars of Atlanta high society, and that I was nothing more than a pathetic, envious obstacle trying to drag them down. Spencer held her close, closing his eyes in sheer panic, desperately trying to calculate how much time he had left before the bank seized everything, including the leased office space they were currently standing in. While Spencer was drowning in his own lies, I was sitting comfortably in my towering glass office high above the sprawling Atlanta skyline. The air conditioning hummed softly, masking the aggressive sound of multi-million-dollar deals being negotiated in the surrounding boardrooms. I had instructed Elias to fast-track the acquisition paperwork for the Spencer Holdings portfolio, and the final documents were now resting perfectly aligned on my desk. The thick stack of legal paper represented absolute total dominion over my family's financial existence. I picked up my heavy custom fountain pen, feeling the cold, smooth metal against my skin. I did not hesitate for a single second. I leaned forward and signed my name on the final authorization line, executing a highly aggressive corporate maneuver that officially transferred $12 million of toxic, unrecoverable debt directly into the hands of my private equity firm. I had just authorized the massive purchase, completely bypassing the standard risk assessment protocols because this was not a normal business transaction. This was a deeply personal, highly calculated execution. I flipped to the final page of the portfolio where the residential warranty deed and the secondary mortgage lien for my parents' house were securely attached. My signature on the acquisition document meant that my firm was now the sole legal owner of that specific debt. I was now officially the primary creditor holding the absolute executive power to foreclose on the very house I had grown up in. The irony was sharp and delicious. They had mocked my career, calling me a glorified office janitor, entirely unaware that I had just swept their entire fake empire into the trash. The legal transfer would take approximately 72 hours to clear through the federal banking systems. For those 3 days, Spencer would exist in a terrifying limbo, knowing his debt had been sold, but having absolutely no idea who the ruthless new creditor actually was. I intended to let him sweat, letting the anxiety eat away at his sanity before I finally dropped the heavy, devastating hammer. I handed the signed portfolio back to Elias, instructing him to initiate the final transfer and to prepare the necessary foreclosure documents for immediate deployment when I gave the signal. Completely blind to the massive legal tsunami that was rapidly approaching her, Vanessa decided to double down on her fake, luxurious lifestyle. The public humiliation at the anniversary dinner and the shredded tax document had only fueled her desperate need to project an image of untouchable wealth. She needed the elite circles of Atlanta to believe that she was still reigning supreme at the very top of the social hierarchy. She could not afford to let any rumors of financial instability take root in the highly judgmental country club gossip mill. Vanessa aggressively took to social media, posting a rapid-fire series of highly curated, heavily filtered photos and videos. She documented a massive shopping spree at the most exclusive luxury boutiques in Buckhead, flashing shopping bags from designers that I knew for a fact Spencer could absolutely no longer afford. She posted a staged, overly enthusiastic video of herself picking up a brand new, top-of-the-line Porsche Cayenne directly from the dealership, prominently displaying the temporary dealer tags. She claimed it was a spontaneous, just because gift from her incredibly successful, wealthy husband, completely hiding the reality that the car was likely leased under a desperate, predatory financing agreement. Her social media feeds were entirely flooded with constant, eager updates about her meticulous preparations for the upcoming Atlanta Heritage Charity Gala. It was the absolute premier social event of the season, a highly exclusive gathering of the most powerful, wealthy, and influential Black families in the entire city. Securing a VIP table at the gala was the ultimate status symbol, a very public declaration that you truly belonged among the elite. Vanessa posted multiple videos of herself trying on extravagant rented designer gowns, bragging loudly about the massive corporate donations Spencer was supposedly preparing to make at the highly publicized event. She was aggressively building a towering, fragile house of cards, completely unaware that a hurricane was quickly approaching. She was so deeply desperate to maintain the pristine illusion of her golden child status that she was willing to drag her husband deeper into severe, unrecoverable debt just to look good for a single night. I watched her frantic social media performance from the quiet luxury of my $4 million penthouse, sipping a glass of expensive wine. I knew exactly what was coming. The gala was scheduled for this upcoming Saturday night, and it was going to be the perfect, highly public stage for the absolute and total annihilation of their pathetic fake empire. The luxurious, high-end boutiques of Phipps Plaza were practically vibrating with the frantic, chaotic energy of Atlanta high society as wealthy socialites desperately prepared for the highly anticipated upcoming Heritage Charity Gala. Deep inside, a highly exclusive private fitting room that smelled heavily of expensive gardenia, perfume, and chilled champagne, Vanessa and Brenda were aggressively sorting through a massive rolling rack of heavily beaded designer gowns. The stark, terrifying reality of their total financial ruin had completely failed to penetrate their incredibly thick state of absolute delusion. Spencer had spent the entire previous evening desperately spinning a new masterful web of deceit, assuring his highly gullible wife and equally superficial mother-in-law that a massive multi-million-dollar commercial real estate deal was actively closing on the very night of the gala. He had stared them dead in the eyes and promised them that this legendary phantom corporate deal would not only instantly clear up all of their temporary and annoying liquidity issues, but would also permanently elevate their family to an entirely new echelon of untouchable Black excellence and elite wealth. Vanessa swallowed the massive lie with terrifying ease because her fragile ego simply could not imagine a world where she was not the absolute sparkling center of the wealthy universe. She stood proudly in front of a massive, gilded trifold mirror, turning side to side to admire a breathtaking emerald green silk gown that cost significantly more than most hard-working people's entire annual salary. She confidently handed her newly acquired high-interest credit card to the fawning sales associate, completely and utterly ignoring the dangerous fact that she had just opened this specific credit account only yesterday with a highly predatory interest rate just to temporarily maintain her fake rich aesthetic. The nervous sales associate discreetly ran the plastic card, holding her breath as the digital machine processed the massive, ungodly transaction. When the machine finally beeped with a miraculous approval, Vanessa let out a loud, arrogant sigh of immense relief, expertly masking it as a sigh of deep exhaustion from her supposedly busy and demanding social schedule. She truly believed she was fooling everyone in the room with her performance of casual, careless wealth. Brenda sat heavily on a plush velvet sofa nearby, holding up a heavily sequined silver column dress against her chest while sipping her third glass of complimentary champagne. She loudly praised Vanessa for choosing such a stunning, wealthy-looking gown, proudly proclaiming to the entire boutique staff that they desperately needed to look like absolute royalty when Spencer finally announced his massive corporate triumph at the gala tonight. Brenda firmly and delusionally believed that tonight's highly publicized event would completely and permanently erase the deeply embarrassing restaurant incident from the gossiping minds of their elite country club friends. She happily handed over her own freshly issued silver credit card, eagerly maxing it out entirely just to secure the overnight rental of a massive diamond parure that she desperately needed to outshine the other prominent wealthy women at her designated VIP table. They spent the entire humid afternoon aggressively swiping plastic they could absolutely not afford, happily diving headfirst into a dark, terrifying ocean of severe toxic debt just to keep their beautiful, glittering house of cards standing for a few more pathetic hours. They genuinely and wholeheartedly believed that tonight's charity gala would be the absolute glorious peak of their social dominance, completely unaware that the fragile foundation of their fake empire had already been violently dismantled and that the ground was rapidly opening up beneath their feet. While my mother and sister were busy happily burying themselves under massive, suffocating mountains of high-interest retail debt, my personal cell phone suddenly illuminated with a very lengthy incoming text message. The sender flashing on the bright screen was my father, Jerome. He had spent the last few agonizing days stewing in a highly toxic, miserable of severely damaged pride and absolute blistering fury over my calm refusal to blindly sign my financial life away for his favorite golden son-in-law. Finding a pathetic burst of courage behind the safe digital shield of a text message, he decided to unleash decades of suppressed parental resentment and perfectly polished narcissism directly onto my glowing screen. The message was a sprawling, bitterly formatted manifesto of absolute total rejection. He started the massive text wall by explicitly stating that I had completely failed my fundamental sacred duties as a respectful daughter, and that my malicious, stubborn refusal to help my struggling family in their minor time of need was a disgusting, unforgivable display of pure, unadulterated selfishness. He formally declared with heavy dramatic words that I was a massive, tragic disappointment to the proud legacy he had supposedly built from the ground up, and that he deeply regretted ever trying to warmly include me in their prestigious social circles. The specific words he chose were incredibly sharp, deliberately weaponized to inflict maximum emotional damage on the scared little girl he arrogantly thought still lived inside my head. He officially proclaimed that from this exact specific moment forward, I was entirely dead to them. He stated that I was completely disowned legally and emotionally stripped of my family name and forever banished from the warm, protective embrace of their highly conditional love. The sheer blinding audacity of his concluding paragraph was almost breathtaking in its profound ignorance and arrogance. Jerome explicitly and sternly forbade me from ever daring to show my face in the elite exclusive circles of Atlanta high society ever again. He aggressively threatened that if I ever attempted to attend another prominent social event, he and Spencer would personally ensure that my professional reputation in the city was entirely and permanently ruined. He commanded me to crawl back to my miserable, lonely, pathetic life and to stay far away from the glowing, untouchable success of my beautiful sister and her incredibly wealthy, powerful husband. He actually believed he possessed the vast social authority to successfully exile me from my own city. He truly thought his harsh, cruel, digital words would completely break my fragile spirit, sending me sobbing violently into a dark, isolated corner to miserably mourn the tragic loss of my highly abusive family. He had absolutely no idea that his vicious, desperate text message was not a tragic execution order, but rather a beautifully timed engraved invitation to his own total catastrophic destruction. I read the entire sprawling message twice, simply absorbing the cold, undeniable reality of his deep hatred for me. There was absolutely no heavy sadness in my chest. There were no hot tears pooling in my eyes. The final, frayed, delicate thread of my familial obligation completely snapped and dissolved into silent dust, leaving behind nothing but cold, brilliant clarity. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone for one final, quiet, deliberate moment, perfectly locking away the digital memory of my father's cruel, absolute rejection. Then, with a single, fluid, effortless motion of my thumb, I swiped left and permanently deleted the entire massive message without sending a single, solitary word in reply. Absolute, deafening silence is often the most terrifying and devastating response to a raging narcissist who is desperately seeking an emotional reaction. I casually tossed the phone onto my plush velvet vanity chair and turned my total, undivided attention toward the magnificent, heavy garment hanging silently in the exact center of my massive walk-in closet. Tonight was absolutely not just another mundane charity networking event. It was a highly orchestrated public corporate execution, and an executioner must always dress perfectly appropriately for the bloody occasion. My personal stylist had completely outdone herself this time, successfully securing a breathtaking custom-made couture gown direct from a highly exclusive private atelier in Milan. The dress was a flawless architectural masterpiece of deep midnight obsidian silk that cascaded around my athletic figure like dark, heavy liquid glass. It was entirely and scandalously backless, featuring a dangerously sharp plunging neckline and intricate hand-stitched jet-black Swarovski crystals that aggressively caught the ambient light like a violent starlit sky. It was absolutely not a dress designed to quietly blend into the background. It was a weaponized gown engineered to completely command, conquer, and suffocate every single ounce of oxygen in the massive ballroom. I slipped into the cold, heavy silk, feeling the luxurious, expensive fabric settle perfectly against my skin like a suit of impenetrable midnight armor. I carefully secured a pair of stunning vintage diamond drop earrings that had cost significantly more than my parents' very first mortgage, and stepped into a pair of impossibly high-pointed black stilettos that practically demanded absolute instant submission from the polished floorboards beneath them. My dark hair was styled into a sleek, flawless geometric bob that perfectly mirrored the sharp, merciless precision of my ruthlessly corporate mindset. As I was applying the final perfect stroke of deep matte crimson lipstick, my private elevator softly chimed, signaling the prompt arrival of my executive assistant, Elias. He stepped into the grand marble foyer of the penthouse dressed in a crisp, black-tailored tuxedo, holding a sleek, highly polished black leather portfolio tightly against his side. He walked directly into the master suite, maintaining his perfect stoic professionalism. But I could clearly see the faint, glittering glimmer of pure predatory anticipation dancing in his dark, serious eyes. He stopped a respectful, appropriate distance away, and firmly held out the heavy black portfolio. He quietly informed me that the final massive wire transfers had successfully and permanently cleared the federal banking systems exactly 5 minutes ago. Spencer Holdings was officially and completely dissolved. My private equity firm was now the sole, indisputable legal owner of every single toxic asset, every fraudulent commercial loan, and every desperate secondary residential mortgage lien that Spencer had ever hastily signed his desperate name to. The massive financial trap was flawlessly, permanently set, and the heavy steel cage had officially slammed shut around my family's entire fake plastic empire. I reached out and took the cold, firm leather folder from his gloved hands, feeling the immense, terrifying weight of absolute, total financial dominance resting right in my own palms. I looked at my reflection in the massive, gilded, full-length mirror, seeing a completely unrecognizable, incredibly powerful and dangerous woman staring back at me. The mocked, glorified office janitor was dead and buried deep in the dirt. The bitter, jealous sister simply did not exist. The ugly, ungrateful, disowned daughter was a total, pathetic lie. I was the senior liquidator, and I was about to walk into the absolute most exclusive high society gathering in the entire state of Georgia to violently repossess my family's entire pathetic existence. I calmly handed the heavy portfolio back to Elias, instructing him to keep it perfectly secure at his side until I gave the absolute final signal. I grabbed my designer clutch, took one last deep breath of the cool, filtered penthouse air, and walked out the door to completely shatter their entire world. The grand ballroom of the Atlanta Heritage Charity Gala was an absolute masterclass in extreme opulence and untouched elite privilege. The sweeping venue was decorated with cascading walls of rare white orchids and dripping crystal chandeliers that cast a warm golden glow over the most powerful and influential Black families in the entire state of Georgia. Outside, the massive double doors, the red carpet was completely swarmed by local media and society photographers who were desperately flashing their cameras to capture the flawless arrival of the city's absolute highest echelon. Walking right into this blinding storm of flashing bulbs and shouting reporters were my parents, Brenda and Jerome, followed closely by my sister Vanessa and her husband Spencer. They walked down the plush crimson carpet with their heads held incredibly high, projecting an absolute master illusion of untouchable generational wealth. Vanessa paused every few steps to dramatically pose for the cameras, making sure the bright lights perfectly captured the heavy emerald green silk gown she had recklessly purchased on a highly predatory credit card just hours before. She offered the reporters a practiced, haughty smile, completely soaking in the superficial validation she so desperately craved to fill her empty life. Brenda walked beside her wearing a heavily sequined silver dress and the rented diamond parure that sparkled violently against her collarbone. Brenda and Jerome waved to the crowd, acting like absolute royalty, gracing the peasants with their magnificent presence, completely blind to the fact that they were financially bleeding to death beneath their expensive rented armor. Spencer trailed slightly behind them aggressively, working the crowd with the frantic, desperate energy of a drowning man grasping at floating debris. He wore a sharply tailored tuxedo and flashed a bright artificial smile, forcefully shaking hands with local city councilmen, prominent real estate developers, and wealthy hospital administrators. He laughed loudly, slapping powerful men on the back, and leaning in close to whisper empty promises about massive upcoming commercial acquisitions that simply did not exist. He was sweating profusely underneath the heavy fabric of his expensive suit, terrified that his massive $12 million house of cards was about to violently collapse, but he pushed the panic deep down into his stomach. He desperately needed the elite investors in this specific ballroom to believe the carefully crafted illusion that Spencer Holdings was currently thriving. He believed that if he could just schmooze the right billionaire tonight, he could secure a miracle emergency loan to pay off the toxic debt that was silently suffocating him. Vanessa linked her arm through his, leaning her head against his shoulder, and proudly telling passing socialites that her brilliant husband was closing a monumental corporate deal that very evening. They truly believed they were the absolute kings and queens of the Atlanta social scene, completely unaware that the guillotine was already polished and waiting for their necks. The lavish gala proceeded smoothly into the late evening, with the wealthy attendees mingling, drinking incredibly expensive champagne, and politely bidding on high-end charity auction items. The atmosphere was thick with the heavy, intoxicating scent of old money and quiet arrogance. Suddenly, the soft, classical jazz music that had been floating through the massive ballroom came to an abrupt, deliberate halt. The sudden silence caused a ripple of confusion to spread through the elegantly dressed crowd as conversations paused and heads turned toward the main stage. The host of the evening, a highly respected local television anchor and prominent community leader, stepped up to the grand glass podium and tapped the microphone. He cleared his throat and looked out over the sea of wealthy donors with a bright, dramatic smile. He announced to the completely silent room that the Heritage Charity Foundation had been facing a severe, devastating financial crisis this year and had been dangerously close to permanently shutting down its vital community outreach programs. A soft, collective gasp echoed through the ballroom as the elite attendees absorbed the shocking news. The host raised his hands to calm the crowd, quickly shifting his tone to one of absolute, profound gratitude. He joyfully proclaimed that a miraculous, completely unprecedented $2 million corporate donation had been anonymously wired to the foundation just 24 hours ago, entirely saving the charity from total ruin. He proudly announced that the monumental donation came directly from the most ruthless and successful private equity firm on the entire East Coast. He asked the entire ballroom to turn their attention to the grand oak doors at the back of the venue so they could officially welcome the senior partner representing the firm who had personally authorized the massive, life-saving donation. The heavy spotlight violently swung across the room, illuminating the massive carved wooden doors. The entire high society crowd collectively held their breath, waiting to see the mysterious corporate titan who possessed that kind of staggering liquid wealth. Slowly, the heavy brass handles turned, and the massive oak doors swung open to reveal the grand marble foyer beyond. I stood perfectly framed in the center of the doorway, bathed entirely in the blinding white spotlight, wearing my scandalous backless midnight obsidian silk gown. The heavy jet-black crystals caught the intense light, throwing sharp violet reflections across the darkened ballroom. Elias stood one step behind my right shoulder, holding the sleek black leather portfolio that contained my family's absolute financial destruction. Standing one step behind my left shoulder was Richard, the incredibly famous multi-billionaire chief executive officer of my private equity firm, a ruthless older white man who was widely feared and respected across the entire global financial sector. A profound heavy shockwave violently rippled through the massive ballroom as the spotlight illuminated my face. The absolute deafening silence that gripped the room was utterly terrifying in its perfection. Slowly at first and then all at once, the densely packed crowd of mayors, billionaires and elite socialites physically parted down the center of the room like the Red Sea, offering me a wide, completely unobstructed path directly to the main stage. I stepped forward, my impossibly high-pointed black stilettos clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floor, a sound that echoed like a ticking clock counting down to my family's total execution. The wealthiest and most powerful figures in Atlanta stepped back, bowing their heads slightly in deep, genuine respect as I floated past them, radiating an aura of cold, untouchable, absolute power. Sitting at a premier VIP table near the very front of the stage, my family watched my grand entrance in a state of absolute paralyzed horror. Brenda's jaw dropped completely open, the expensive champagne glass slipping from her trembling fingers and shattering loudly against the base of their table. Jerome gripped the edge of his chair, his knuckles turning stark white as his mind violently tried to comprehend why the daughter he had just cruelly disowned by text message was being treated like a conquering queen by the very society he worshipped. Vanessa desperately tried to preserve her shattered reality. Her face contorted into a bizarre, terrified smile as she forcefully grabbed the arm of a wealthy socialite standing next to her. Vanessa aggressively whispered that this was all just a massive, embarrassing mistake and that the catering company must have accidentally let the hired help wander into the main ballroom. She frantically tried to laugh it off, telling everyone at her table that I was just her broke, pathetic sister who probably snuck past the security guards to steal free food. But her desperate, pathetic lies completely died in her throat when she looked over at her husband. Spencer was not laughing. The fake, arrogant smile he had worn all night had completely vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, absolute, visceral terror. His wide, panicked eyes darted from my calm, composed face to the older, powerful billionaire, standing respectfully just one step behind me. Spencer had spent months desperately pitching his fraudulent company to Richard's private equity firm, begging them for a bailout, and he knew exactly what that ruthless man looked like. He watched Richard defer to me, allowing me to lead the way, and the devastating math finally clicked into place inside his terrified brain. Spencer realized in that horrible, breathtaking moment that his supposedly broke sister-in-law was the senior partner at the exact firm that had just legally acquired his $12 million of toxic debt. He realized that the woman in the midnight silk gown walking toward the stage was the ultimate apex predator who now entirely owned his company, his cars, and the very house his in-laws were currently sleeping in. The remaining color violently drained from Spencer's face, leaving his skin the color of dirty ash as his knees physically buckled beneath the table, his fake empire instantly turning to dust before I even reached the microphone. As the initial shockwaves of my grand entrance rippled through the room, the host of the gala, completely oblivious to the personal family drama unfolding, stepped back to the microphone to announce the beginning of the open mic networking portion of the evening, a highly anticipated tradition where Atlanta elite could briefly pitch their charitable foundations or upcoming civic projects to the room full of billionaires. The moment the host asked if anyone would like to take the floor, a violent commotion erupted at the VIP table near the front. Spencer, having just realized the terrifying reality of my identity and the presence of my billionaire boss Richard, completely lost whatever tiny fraction of sanity he had left. He knew with absolute terrifying certainty that his $12 million debt had been acquired and that the hourglass on his fake empire had completely run out of sand. In a blinding panic, he convinced himself that his only possible chance of survival was to secure a massive emergency investment right here and right now, before I reached the main stage and had the chance to open my mouth and destroy him. Spencer abruptly shoved his chair back, the heavy wooden legs screeching loudly against the marble floor, and practically sprinted toward the main stage. Vanessa reached out to grab his tuxedo jacket. Her face twisted in utter confusion, but he violently yanked himself out of her grasp, almost knocking her over in the process. He practically shoved the polite television host aside and grabbed the microphone with trembling, sweaty hands. The entire ballroom murmured in deep discomfort at his highly erratic, aggressive behavior. Spencer completely ignored the strict etiquette of the charity gala and launched into a frantic, manic business pitch. His voice echoed loudly through the room, pitching a massive, non-existent commercial real estate development project in the heart of downtown. He was sweating profusely, heavy drops of moisture rolling down his forehead and soaking into the collar of his expensive, rented tuxedo. He spoke with a terrifying, manic speed, throwing out meaningless corporate buzzwords and promising absolutely impossible financial returns to anyone who would write him a check tonight. He frantically waved his free hand in the air, begging the room full of billionaires and venture capitalists to get in on the ground floor of this historic opportunity. He claimed his company, Spencer Holdings, was on the verge of a billion-dollar expansion, and that he was offering a highly exclusive chance for a select few angel investors to join his inner circle. The desperation radiating from his body was so thick and foul that you could practically smell it in the air. The wealthy elites sitting at their candlelit tables stared at him in absolute stunned silence, exchanging highly uncomfortable glances. They were seasoned corporate predators, and they instantly recognized the frantic thrashing of a drowning man. Spencer was completely unraveling live on stage, his fake, old-money accent slipping into a panicked, breathless ramble as he desperately begged the room for the very cash he needed to save his life. My parents, Brenda and Jerome, sat frozen at their table, their faces pale with shock, watching their perfect golden son-in-law humiliate himself and their family name in front of the most powerful people in the entire state of Georgia. They had no idea why he was acting like a cornered animal, but the sheer public embarrassment of his manic performance was already destroying their fragile social standing. They looked around the room, seeing the disgusted faces of the politicians and business owners they so desperately wanted to impress, feeling the heavy, crushing weight of secondhand embarrassment. Spencer continued to babble into the microphone, his eyes darting wildly around the room looking for anyone who would offer him a lifeline, but he was met with nothing but cold, judgmental stares. I stood perfectly still near the grand entrance of the ballroom, watching his pathetic public meltdown with a deep, cold sense of predatory amusement. Richard leaned over slightly, whispering that it was almost sad to watch a man destroy himself so thoroughly in front of the entire city. I did not feel any sadness whatsoever. I felt only the cold, sharp edge of absolute justice, preparing to strike down upon the people who had abused me for my entire life. I handed my designer clutch to Elias and began a slow, deliberate walk down the center aisle toward the main stage. The heavy silence of the confused crowd amplified the sharp, rhythmic clicking of my pointed black stilettos against the polished marble floor. Every single eye in the massive ballroom shifted from the sweating manic man on the stage to the calm, powerful woman in the midnight silk gown walking toward him. The guests parted slightly as I walked past them, completely captivated by the intense aura of authority that surrounded me. As I approached the carpeted steps leading up to the stage, Spencer finally caught sight of me out of the corner of his eye. The frantic, desperate words completely died in his throat mid-sentence. His mouth hung open, and his chest heaved as he stared down at me, his eyes wide with absolute visceral terror. He gripped the microphone so tightly that his knuckles turned stark white, but he was completely paralyzed, unable to move a single muscle as I elegantly ascended the stairs. I walked right up to him, my posture perfectly straight, and my expression completely devoid of any emotion. I did not yell or scream or show any signs of the bitter, angry sister my family desperately wanted me to be. I simply reached out my hand and placed my fingers directly over his trembling hand on the microphone. Spencer looked like he was going to vomit right there on the stage, his breathing rapid and shallow, but he did not resist my touch. He was completely broken by the sheer magnitude of the power dynamic shifting violently against him. I smoothly slid the microphone out of his sweaty grip and stepped to the center of the podium, effectively pushing him into the background shadows where he belonged. The bright stage lights caught the jet-black crystals on my gown, projecting an image of complete and total corporate dominance across the silent room. I looked out over the sea of wealthy donors, billionaires, and local politicians who were all waiting with bated breath to see what the mysterious corporate sponsor was about to do. I raised the microphone to my lips and spoke in a voice that was terrifyingly calm, smooth, and impeccably professional. I began by thanking the foundation host for the lovely evening and extending my deepest gratitude to the esteemed guests who had gathered to support such a vital community cause. I spoke with the practiced, flawless cadence of a senior executive, addressing a boardroom, making it abundantly clear that I belonged on that stage far more than the sweating fraud standing behind me. I then smoothly transitioned my tone, adding a sharp, cold edge of absolute, unyielding authority. I informed the silent, captivated audience that as the primary corporate sponsor of the evening and a senior partner at one of the largest private equity firms in the country, I had a strict professional and ethical obligation to protect the financial integrity of the esteemed colleagues sitting in the room. I stated that it was my sworn corporate duty to actively prevent fraudulent predatory behavior whenever it occurred in my presence, especially at a charity gala designed to help the local community. The tension in the massive ballroom was so incredibly thick, it felt like the air itself had crystallized into glass. No one dared to take a breath or even shift in their seats as they waited for the executioner's axe to fall. I slowly turned my head and locked my eyes directly onto Spencer, who was physically trembling in the dark shadows of the stage, looking completely small and utterly pathetic. I stared at him with cold, dead eyes, completely stripping away the last remaining shreds of his fake, arrogant identity. The microphone amplified my voice so that every single syllable rang out with devastating, absolute clarity across the massive, silent room. I told him that it was incredibly brave to stand up here and pitch a massive, multi-million-dollar commercial development project to a room full of seasoned, brilliant investors. I paused for a single deliberate second, letting the heavy silence hang over the crowd before delivering the fatal, unstoppable blow. I said, "Spencer, you are pitching a project for a company that officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection early this past Tuesday morning." A massive collective gasp violently ripped through the entire ballroom. Hundreds of wealthy elites simultaneously inhaled in pure, unadulterated shock as the massive explosive bomb was dropped directly into the center of their highly exclusive gathering. I did not raise my voice or break my professional composure for even a fraction of a second. I continued my public execution with the cold, ruthless precision of a surgeon operating on a fatal tumor. I stated clearly into the microphone that as the senior partner of the private equity firm that just legally acquired his $12 million of highly toxic unrecoverable debt, I strongly suggested that he stop lying to my colleagues immediately. The absolute horror that washed over the room was a breathtaking masterpiece of social and financial destruction. Loud whispers violently erupted across the candlelit tables as billionaires and bank executives realized they had just been aggressively pitched by a completely bankrupt, desperate fraud who was trying to steal their money. I turned my gaze toward the VIP table in the front row where my family was sitting in a state of absolute frozen paralysis. Vanessa's face was completely contorted in sheer blinding terror, her hands covering her mouth as the sparkling illusion of her perfect wealthy marriage was violently ripped apart in front of the entire city. Brenda and Jerome sat entirely rigid, their eyes wide with disbelief and dawning realization as the true identity of their despised daughter was finally broadcast to the world. They finally understood that the woman they had cruelly mocked and disowned was the very same corporate titan who now held their entire lives in her hands. I looked directly at my parents and continued speaking into the microphone, exposing the absolute hollow core of Spencer's fake empire so that no one in Atlanta would ever trust them again. I informed the completely captivated room that Spencer Holdings had absolutely no legitimate revenue streams, no successful commercial developments, and no actual corporate assets to its name. I stated that he had been running a desperate predatory Ponzi scheme, leveraging everything he owned, including properties that did not even legally belong to him, just to maintain a fake country club aesthetic while secretly drowning in an ocean of bad loans and failed investments. I made sure every single person in the high society crowd knew that the man who had been loudly bragging and shaking their hands all evening was nothing more than a pathetic, broke scam artist trying to steal their charity money to save his own sinking ship. Spencer let out a choked, pathetic sob from the back of the stage, covering his face with his shaking hands, as his entire existence was permanently and completely annihilated. He had spent his entire life looking down on people, thinking his white privilege and his fake old money background made him completely untouchable in this society. But in the real ruthless world of corporate liquidations, fake money means absolutely nothing, and I had just aggressively liquidated his entire social standing in less than 3 minutes. I lowered the microphone, breaking the intense eye contact with my horrified parents, and looked back out at the shocked silence of the massive ballroom. The execution was completely flawlessly finished, and there was absolutely nothing left for them but the ashes. The air in the ballroom was already thick with the suffocating stench of Spencer's destroyed reputation, but the true execution was not quite finished. I slowly turned away from the trembling, broken man in the shadows of the stage and directed my cold, unyielding gaze straight down to the front row. The bright stage lights followed my movement, illuminating my parents, Brenda and Jerome, and my sister Vanessa, sitting completely frozen at their premier VIP table. They were staring up at me with expressions of pure, absolute terror, their minds violently rejecting the horrific reality that was unfolding in front of their wealthy peers. Brenda was shaking visibly, her hands gripping the edge of the tablecloth so tightly her knuckles were stark white. Jerome looked like he might actually have a heart attack, his chest heaving as he desperately tried to process the fact that his favorite golden son-in-law was a completely bankrupt fraud. Vanessa was hyperventilating her eyes, darting frantically around the room, desperately looking for anyone to intervene and stop the slaughter, but no one moved. I gripped the edges of the wooden podium, leaning forward slightly so my voice would carry the absolute maximum impact. I spoke slowly, ensuring that every single syllable was perfectly enunciated and completely unavoidable. I said, "And Dad Spencer did not just completely bankrupt his supposedly brilliant investment firm. He did not just lie to his clients and leverage his leased luxury cars." The room held its collective breath, sensing that the final fatal blow was about to be delivered. I continued, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly soft, razor-sharp whisper. I said he secretly took out a massive secondary mortgage on your fully paid-off house to cover his incredibly stupid gambling on toxic stocks. A sharp collective gasp violently ripped through the front rows of the ballroom. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal was breathtaking. I watched my parents' faces completely drain of color, transitioning from pale shock to a sickening shade of gray ash. Jerome's mouth fell open, trying to form words, but absolutely nothing came out. Brenda let out a tiny choked whimper, her hand flying to her chest. I did not let them recover for even a single second. I delivered the final definitive execution. I told them that the very house they had proudly lived in for 30 years, the house they constantly bragged about owning free and clear, had been secretly signed away by the very man they worshipped. And then I said the words that finally broke them completely. I told them that the massive toxic debt portfolio my private equity firm had just legally acquired included the deed to their home. I stated perfectly clearly into the microphone, a house that my firm now legally owns in its entirety. The sheer utter devastation that washed over my family was a profound masterpiece of poetic justice. The heavy, deafening silence in the room finally shattered, replaced by a chaotic eruption of horrified whispers and disgusted murmurs from the Atlanta elite. They were watching a prominent social climbing family being violently, publicly stripped of every single asset they owned by their own despised daughter. The realization that Brenda and Jerome were completely penniless and officially homeless hit the crowd like a shockwave. Their meticulously crafted illusion of untouchable old money status had just been entirely incinerated, leaving nothing but a pile of pathetic, fraudulent debt. The sheer crushing weight of the absolute public humiliation was finally too much for Spencer to bear. The man who had confidently strutted into the gala, acting like a conquering corporate king, had been completely reduced to a terrified, sniveling coward. Realizing that the entire room was now staring at him with absolute unadulterated disgust, and knowing that he was facing inevitable federal fraud charges, Spencer completely broke. He did not try to apologize to his wife. He did not try to explain himself to his ruined in-laws. He simply turned around and literally sprinted off the back of the stage. The sound of his expensive leather shoes scrambling frantically down the wooden stairs echoed loudly through the chaotic ballroom. He violently pushed his way past two bewildered catering waiters and bolted straight through the service exit, completely abandoning his heavily pregnant wife and her ruined parents without a single backward glance. Vanessa watched her husband flee the scene like a terrified rat, and the last fragile thread holding her sanity together completely snapped. The reality of her total, absolute destruction hit her with the force of a speeding train. Her fake wealthy lifestyle, her leased Porsche, her country club status, and her entire arrogant identity were completely gone, wiped out in less than 5 minutes. She let out a loud guttural sob that sounded more animal than human, and her knees simply gave out. She collapsed entirely onto the marble floor, her breathtaking, heavily beaded emerald green designer gown pooling around her shaking body in a tragic, pathetic heap. She buried her face in her hands, crying hysterically right in the middle of the most exclusive charity gala of the season, surrounded by the very people she had spent her entire life desperately trying to impress. Brenda and Jerome did not even attempt to comfort their sobbing golden child. They were completely physically paralyzed by the terrifying realization that their perfect white son-in-law had left them absolutely homeless and utterly penniless. Jerome stared blankly at the empty spot on the stage where Spencer had been standing, his mind completely broken by the magnitude of the betrayal. Brenda remained frozen in her chair, her eyes wide and glassy, staring vacantly at the shattered pieces of her champagne glass on the floor. They had sacrificed their relationship with their own daughter to worship a man who had secretly stolen the literal roof from over their heads. The bitter, crushing irony of their situation was so incredibly profound that it had completely short-circuited their brains, leaving them sitting there like two empty, pathetic shells. The reaction from the elite Atlanta crowd was swift, cold, and utterly merciless. High society circles are incredibly protective of their exclusive ecosystems, and they have absolutely zero tolerance for desperate, pathetic frauds who attempt to infect their ranks. The wealthy billionaires, powerful politicians, and prominent socialites who had been politely smiling at my family just an hour ago now looked at them with pure, unfiltered disgust. They physically turned their backs on the sobbing Vanessa and the paralyzed parents, creating a wide, distinct circle of isolation around the ruined family. The sheer social shun was absolute and immediate. No one offered them a napkin, no one asked if they were all right, and absolutely no one offered to help Vanessa off the floor. They were officially and permanently exiled from the very society they had sacrificed everything to belong to. The host of the gala, clearly recognizing that the situation had completely deteriorated beyond repair, discreetly signaled the venue security team. 4 large, imposing security guards in crisp black suits swiftly approached the VIP table. They did not offer polite requests. They issued firm, unyielding commands. They instructed Jerome and Brenda to stand up and ordered the hysterically sobbing Vanessa to get off the floor. The guards formed a tight perimeter around the ruined family, aggressively escorting them away from their prominent table and marching them directly toward the main exit doors. The entire ballroom watched in cold, silent judgment as the family who had arrogantly walked down the red carpet acting like royalty was now being unceremoniously thrown out of the building like common trash. I stood perfectly still at the center of the stage, watching them being marched out of the grand ballroom. I felt absolutely no regret, no guilt, and no lingering sadness. I felt only the cold, crisp satisfaction of a completely flawless execution. I handed the microphone back to the bewildered host, offering him a polite, professional nod, and gracefully descended the stage stairs. The crowd parted for me once again, offering me murmurs of deep respect and absolute awe as I walked back down the center aisle. The mocked, glorified office janitor had just brutally dismantled an entire fraudulent empire, and the city's elite now knew exactly who I truly was. I returned to my premier VIP table where Richard and Elias were waiting. Richard offered me a slow, approving smile, deeply impressed by the ruthless precision of my corporate slaughter. I elegantly took my seat, smoothing the midnight silk of my gown, and picked up my crystal glass of expensive champagne. I raised the glass slightly, offering a silent toast to the empty doors at the back of the room, as the jazz band, taking their cue from the host, finally resumed, playing their soft, elegant music, completely washing away the last, lingering traces of my family's pathetic existence. 3 days after the spectacular collapse at the gala, the relentless Atlanta heat seemed to press down on the city with a heavy, suffocating weight that perfectly matched the desperate reality of my ruined family. The sheer magnitude of their public destruction had finally pierced through their incredibly thick layers of absolute delusion. The elite circles they worshipped had instantly violently expelled them, and the terrifying countdown clock on their total financial ruin was loudly ticking down to zero. Spencer had completely vanished into the wind, leaving his heavily pregnant wife and her parents to face the massive, terrifying hurricane of debt he had secretly accumulated. They had absolutely nowhere left to hide and no one left to manipulate. Their only remaining option was the one person they had spent 30 years tearing down, the very daughter they had cruelly publicly disowned just a few days prior. My massive corporate headquarters buzzed with the usual intense, aggressive energy of multi-million-dollar acquisitions and ruthless financial negotiations. I was sitting in my glass corner office reviewing the final execution orders for the Spencer Holdings liquidation when my desk phone softly chimed. It was the head of building security, his voice unusually tense. He informed me that 3 individuals claiming to be my immediate family had somehow managed to slip past the outer security perimeter by aggressively tailgating a large delivery group. He stated they were currently standing in the main executive lobby, loudly demanding to see me and creating a highly uncomfortable scene for the passing corporate partners. I did not feel a single ounce of surprise. A cornered rat will always bite, and my family was completely out of options. I calmly instructed security to hold them in the lobby and to prepare for an immediate hostile escort off the premises. I stood up, smoothing out the sharp lines of my tailored charcoal suit, and walked out of my office to deliver the final execution. The executive lobby of my firm was a sprawling, intimidating space of cold white marble and towering glass designed specifically to make visitors feel incredibly small and insignificant. Standing right in the center of this imposing corporate arena were Brenda, Jerome, and Vanessa, looking absolutely pathetic. The polished, flawless facade they had maintained at the anniversary dinner was completely destroyed. Vanessa looked exhausted and terrified, her eyes red-rimmed from days of hysterical crying, her designer clothes replaced by wrinkled sweatpants. Brenda and Jerome looked entirely broken, their postures slumped and defeated, visibly aging under the crushing weight of their impending homelessness. The moment the heavy glass doors of the executive wing slid open and I stepped into the lobby, their desperate eyes locked onto me like I was their only lifeline in a violent storm. The sheer blinding hypocrisy of their sudden desperation was breathtaking. The exact same people who had arrogantly told me I was an ugly, useless burden were now staring at me with expressions of pure, unfiltered terror. Vanessa was the first to completely break down. She physically dropped to her knees on the cold marble floor, sobbing hysterically and begging me to please save them. She cried that she was pregnant, that Spencer had left her with absolutely nothing, and that she had nowhere else to go. She pleaded with me to remember that we were sisters, begging me not to punish her unborn child for her husband's terrible, unforgivable mistakes. Brenda quickly joined her, completely abandoning whatever tiny shred of pride she had left. She aggressively grabbed the edge of my tailored suit jacket, her hands shaking violently as she begged me to please stop the foreclosure on their house. She wept loudly, crying that blood is always thicker than water, and that real family must always protect each other in times of terrible crisis. Jerome stood behind them, his face completely pale, shifting uncomfortably under the harsh bright lights of the lobby. The man who had confidently typed out a massive, cruel text message disowning me was now physically trembling in the presence of my absolute power. He quietly, desperately pleaded that they had simply made a terrible, horrible mistake trusting Spencer, and that they were deeply, profoundly sorry for everything they had ever done to me. He begged me to show some mercy, asking how a daughter could possibly throw her own elderly parents out onto the cold, unforgiving street. Their performance was loud, desperate, and utterly pathetic, echoing off the marble walls of the lobby as passing corporate executives discreetly watched the spectacular meltdown. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the people who had made my entire existence a living nightmare. I did not feel an ounce of pity or a single pang of familial guilt. I felt only the cold, crisp air of the lobby and the heavy, satisfying weight of absolute, total victory. I slowly reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out a small, black velvet box. I looked directly into my mother's tear-filled eyes and gently placed the box onto the marble floor, right in front of her trembling knees. She stared at it in confusion, slowly reaching out to open the lid. When she saw the heavy diamond necklace resting on the dark satin, the necklace she had pawned to the restaurant manager, her breath caught sharply in her throat. I kept my voice completely level, terrifyingly calm, and totally devoid of any emotional warmth. I told her that she was the one who had clearly established the rules of our relationship. I reminded her with slow, deliberate precision that she had proudly declared at the anniversary dinner that real family pays their own way, and that people who do not contribute anything of value should not expect to be fed. I told her that Jerome had called me a glorified janitor, and that Vanessa had loudly, proudly proclaimed that I was a bitter, broke thief who did not deserve a seat at their wealthy table. I stared down at them, the absolute power of the moment radiating from my posture. I stated that I was simply and strictly following the exact harsh rules they had so cruelly taught me. I informed them that the $18,000 dinner bill had been paid, the diamond necklace had been successfully retrieved, and my financial obligations to this family were now permanently, completely severed. I leaned in slightly, delivering the final devastating blow, stating that the legal foreclosure on their home would proceed exactly as scheduled this coming Friday, and that they had exactly 48 hours to completely vacate the premises before the sheriff's department aggressively removed them. Brenda let out a loud, horrific wail, clutching the diamond necklace against her chest as the absolute finality of my words completely shattered her reality. Vanessa slumped forward, sobbing uncontrollably onto the marble floor, her desperate pleas for mercy turning into incoherent gasps. Jerome stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, finally understanding that the quiet, submissive daughter he had bullied for 30 years was truly, entirely dead. I did not let them linger in their misery for another second. I reached back into my blazer pocket and pulled out a thick stack of manila envelopes, casually dropping them onto the floor next to the velvet box. I clearly informed them that those envelopes contained highly aggressive, fully executed legal restraining orders, legally banning all three of them from ever coming within 500 feet of me, my home, or my corporate offices ever again. I took one final, deeply satisfying look at the broken, ruined remains of my toxic family and slowly turned my back on them. I gave a sharp, definitive nod to the towering security guards who immediately moved in, physically pulling my sobbing family off the floor and aggressively escorting them out through the heavy revolving doors, throwing them back out into the harsh, unforgiving heat of the Atlanta streets where they truly belonged. Fast forward exactly 3 incredibly peaceful, luxurious months. The humid summer heat of Atlanta had finally broken, giving way to a crisp, clear autumn evening. I was standing on the expansive, private terrace of my $4 million Buckhead penthouse, wearing a plush silk robe and holding a crystal glass of incredibly expensive vintage wine. The massive, sprawling city skyline glittered brilliantly beneath me, a beautiful, chaotic sea of lights that I now surveyed from the absolute very top of the food chain. The heavy, suffocating toxicity of my past had been completely, surgically removed from my life, and the silence in my massive home was absolutely exquisite. Elias, my ever-faithful assistant, had just delivered my weekly personal briefing, discreetly summarizing the current status of the Spencer Holdings liquidation and the subsequent fallout. The updates were brief, factual, and entirely deeply satisfying. Spencer had been aggressively apprehended by federal agents while attempting to flee the country, and was currently sitting in a federal penitentiary awaiting trial for massive multi-million-dollar wire fraud and severe financial embezzlement. His fake old money empire had been completely sold off for scrap parts, ensuring he would never see a single dime of freedom or wealth ever again. Vanessa, the former glittering golden child of Atlanta high society, was currently working a grueling minimum wage retail job at a local mall, desperately trying to slowly pay off the massive high-interest credit card debt she had recklessly incurred just to rent her designer gala gown. She was completely shunned by her former wealthy friends, forced to live a quiet, exhausting life, entirely stripped of the superficial validation she once so desperately craved. And my parents, Brenda and Jerome, had been officially forcefully evicted from their sprawling suburban home, exactly as promised. They were currently living in a cramped, heavily outdated two-bedroom apartment on the extreme outskirts of the city, far, far away from the elite country clubs and the luxurious society events they had once aggressively dominated. Their pristine reputation was entirely destroyed, their fake wealth completely evaporated, and they were left with absolutely nothing but the crushing daily reality of their own arrogant, terrible choices. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my wine, the rich, complex flavor completely washing over my tongue. The stars above Atlanta were shining brightly, totally unbothered by the petty human drama unfolding far below them. I leaned against the cool glass railing of my penthouse, breathing in the crisp, clean air. I had completely survived their abuse, dismantled their fraudulent empire, and violently repossessed my own self-worth. I was standing absolutely alone at the very top, completely free, completely powerful, and entirely untouchable. The most powerful lesson from this story is that your self-worth should never be tied to the conditional approval of toxic people, even if they share your DNA. For years, Deandra's family tried to diminish her accomplishments to protect their own fragile egos and fake lifestyles. However, true power comes from walking away from abusive environments and building your success in silence. You do not owe your energy, resources, or loyalty to people who only exploit and disrespect you. Setting ironclad boundaries isn't an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-respect and personal freedom. Drop a comment below sharing how you have established healthy boundaries in your own life, and hit that subscribe button for more empowering stories.